Hello everyone. Thank you for tuning in to our webcast on carbon footprinting for companies. This is part of a series of webcasts prepared exclusively by Corporate Citizenship for Bursa Sustain, a website set up by Bursa Malaysia to provide resources for Malaysian public listed companies to help them on their sustainability journey. I am Lawrence, a consultant with Corporate Citizenship, and I will be taking you through this webcast to help you understand the why and how of carbon footprinting. In this session, we will be covering the rationale for carbon footprinting, including climate actions that have been taken in Malaysia and around the world. We will then look at the key steps for performing a carbon footprinting exercise, as well as reporting on GHG emissions. We will also look at two Malaysian companies that have reported on their GHG emissions within their annual sustainability reports, namely IOI and Genting Berhad. By the end of this webcast, you should be able to establish the business case for your company to conduct a carbon footprinting exercise, as well as having the necessary understanding on how to conduct one. Before diving into the details of carbon footprinting, let us look at some of the climate change movements which are happening in Malaysia and around the world. Based on a report released by the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC in 2018, there is a need for temperature rise to be kept well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels by 2030. A recent report covering 520 major cities in the world revealed that Kuala Lumpur is one of the cities that will face unprecedented climate shifts by 2050. This could include changes in rainfall patterns, leading to more severe flooding and droughts, which will have huge impacts on businesses and the economy. In April 2019, the governors of the Bank of England and France Central Bank published an open letter warning of significant risks to the financial system given that carbon emissions need to decline by almost half from 2010 levels in the next decade if we are to reach net zero by 2050, requiring massive reallocation of capital. They warn that companies that fail to adapt will fail to exist. There are also growing calls for rapid actions from citizens around the world, and specifically children who are speaking up and protesting against government's failure to tackle climate change. Swedish Greta Thunberg started the School Strike for Climate movement, which has seen hundreds of thousands of children across the globe go on strike to protest against government and business inaction. As part of the global efforts to fight climate change, Malaysia has pledged to cut national carbon emissions intensity by 45% by 2030. This is also in line with Transformasi Nasional 2050, a plan for Malaysia to be one of 20 best countries in terms of well-being, happiness, and sustainability. The country is also planning to develop a Climate Change Act to institutionalize climate change action across businesses and private sectors, if necessary. The country is also planning to develop a Climate Change Act to institutionalize climate action across businesses and private sectors, if necessary. To ensure that there is a future for businesses to operate in, companies have a responsibility to support these national and global targets through the reduction of its own greenhouse gas or GHG emissions. There is now a rapid increase in companies adopting the science-based targets, which are GHG reduction targets that aim to achieve a defined global goal of limiting global temperature increase to 1.5 or way below 2 degrees relative to pre-industrial levels. However, before you can start thinking about reducing your emissions and setting targets in line with the latest climate science, you must first measure what you emit. This is typically called a carbon footprinting exercise. So what exactly is carbon footprinting? Carbon footprinting is a process used to measure the total amount of GHG emissions expressed in carbon dioxide equivalent or CO2e caused directly or indirectly by a company, person, event, or product. Here are some examples of what carbon footprinting can help a company with. Understand key emission sources and quantify GHG emissions. By listing down sources and measuring the associated emissions, a company will be able to identify where the greatest sources of emissions come from. For example, a company may find that the bulk of its emissions come from the use of purchased electricity. This will then help the company to identify opportunities to reduce its emissions and set ambitious but practical targets for reduction. Using the same example as before, the company can now identify energy reduction measures such as switching to more energy-efficient equipment. Report on emissions. Companies are increasingly expected to report on its non-financial performance. This will then help the company to identify opportunities to reduce its emissions and set ambitious but practical targets for reduction. Using the same example as before, the company can now identify energy reduction measures such as switching to more energy-efficient equipment. Report on emissions. companies are increasingly expected to report on its non-financial performance, including how it manages its climate risks. Sustainability reporting is mandated for listed companies in Malaysia, and ratings and indices such as CDP and the Dow Jones Sustainability Index, which are increasingly being looked at by investors, also require companies to report on their emissions. Lastly, continuous monitoring of emissions will help the company to assess its performance against targets. Ultimately, the management and reduction of GHG emissions can potentially reduce a company's operating costs, improve its reputation, and manage long-term business risk and opportunities, such as regulatory changes like carbon pricing. Listed on these slides are 4 main steps to establishing an organization's footprint. The first step is adopting a standard. This standard will serve as a guidance on how a company should collect and report on its emissions data. Available standards include ISO 14064 and the GHG Protocol, which is what we will be referencing for this webcast. The second step is defining the organizational and operational boundaries. This step is crucial in determining what data should be included as well as sources of emissions. The third step is collating the data. This stage is used to close any data gaps as well as identifying any assumptions that have been made in the exercise. The last main step will be to apply emissions factor. GHG emissions are typically expressed in carbon dioxide equivalent. This allows different greenhouse gases to be compared relative to 1 unit of carbon dioxide. Data verification is useful if the company wants to provide confidence to its data and increase its credibility. Let us now look at the details of the 4 steps. Let us now go into details of each of the 4 steps. As mentioned, we will be referencing the GHG Protocol for the purpose of this webcast. The GHG Protocol was developed in 2001 by the World Resources Institute, WRI, and the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, WBCSD. The GHG Protocol was developed in 2001 by the World Resources Institute and the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. It is currently the most widely used carbon accounting standards, and users can access the guidance materials for free. For corporate reporting, 3 main approaches can be used to consolidate GHG emissions: the equity share approach, the financial control approach, and the operational control approach. If the reporting organization wholly owns and operates all of its activities, then it does not matter which approach is selected. In most instances, companies can use the operational approach. However, this can be more complex for companies with joint ventures or leased assets. Based on the GHG Protocol, under the equity share approach, a company accounts for GHG emissions from operations according to its share of equity in the operation. A company has financial control over an operation if the company has an ability to direct the financial and operating policies of the operation with a view to gaining economic benefits from its activities. A company has operational control over an operation if the company or one or more of its subsidiaries has full autonomy to introduce and implement its operating policies at the operations. Only one approach can be used to prepare an inventory, and that approach must be applied consistently across an organization's operations. When considering which organizational approach best suits your needs, it is important to question the level of control you hold over decisions that will influence emissions and consider which approach best reflects your level of control. After identifying your organizational boundary, you will now need to define the operational boundary. Based on the GHG Protocol, emissions releasing activities are classified into 3 categories or scopes. Scope 1 or direct emissions are emissions from activities owned or controlled by your organization. These include emissions from combustion in owned or controlled boilers, furnaces, and vehicles. These include emissions from combustion in owned or controlled boilers, furnaces, and vehicles. Scope 2 or indirect emissions are emissions associated with your organization's consumption of purchased electricity, heat, steam, and cooling. These indirect emissions are a result of your organization's activities, but occur at sources which you do not own or control. Scope 3 emissions are other indirect emissions which are a result of your organization's activities, but occur at sources which you do not own or control, and which are not classified as Scope 2 emissions. Examples of Scope 3 emissions include business travel by means not owned or controlled by your organization, waste disposal, and purchased materials. Carbon dioxide produced from combustion of biomass or biofuels should be reported separately. Based on the GHG Protocol, all operational footprints must include Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. Increasingly, and especially given the current rapid uptake of science-based targets for emissions, Companies are expected to measure their Scope 3 or value chain emissions as well, starting with those that you have the most control over, for example, business travel. So, what are these greenhouse gases that you will need to measure? Greenhouse gases trap heat in the atmosphere. Under normal conditions, they keep the Earth warm enough for life to flourish. Unfortunately, too much of these gases in the atmosphere means that more heat is trapped within Earth, upsetting the natural balance. A major contributor to these additional amounts of GHG in the atmosphere comes from man-made activities. There are 7 main greenhouse gases listed in the Kyoto Protocol. Carbon dioxide, the most prevalent GHG, is emitted from the combustion of fossil fuels, deforestation, and cement production. Methane, emitted from fossil fuel production, agriculture, and landfills. Nitrous oxide, application of fertilizers, combustion of fossil fuels and biomass, as well as the industrial processes. Other main GHG includes hydrofluorocarbons, perfluorocarbons, sulfur hexafluoride, and nitrogen trifluoride. There are other GHGs emitted into the atmosphere because of human activities not covered by the Kyoto Protocol. There are relatively few organizations that emit these gases, but an organization can report on them if quantity is substantial. Each of these GHGs have different effects on the Earth's warming, also known as global warming potential, or GWP. In order to measure the combined impact of all these gases from your organization's activity, they will have to be converted to carbon dioxide equivalent, which we will explore in the next slide. GHG emissions can be calculated by multiplying emissions factor to activity data from your organization. Activity data can be obtained from bills, invoices, receipts, and even records such as liters of fuels consumed by your organization's vehicles. If you're not able to calculate your emissions from known activity data, an estimation may be required based on available information. Apart from activity data and emissions factor, we will also need to take the global warming potential into consideration. As mentioned, each GHG has a different GWP relative to carbon dioxide, which has a global warming potential of 1. The global warming potential values can be obtained from the latest IPCC reports. Here is an example of how we can calculate GHG emissions. The burning of fuel in a stationary source emits carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. If we assume 100 liters of diesel consumption, we can multiply the fuel consumption in volume unit by the relevant emission factor. Since the global warming potential of carbon dioxide is 1, we will multiply the results by 1. The steps are then repeated for subsequent gases, applying the right emission factors and GWP. The summation of different gas emissions will provide you with the total greenhouse gas emissions by this activity. So, where can we get the information on emission factors? Shown on this slide are some examples of published emission sources. While there are many references to obtain emission factors from, the important thing is to be consistent and ensure that the factors best reflect the activity, taking into account its location. Companies may go through significant structural changes over time, including acquisitions, divestments, and mergers. Such changes will alter the company's historical emissions profile. For example, if you sell a portion of your business, your emissions may be reduced the following year, which may seem like you have made great progress towards your target. However, we know that that's not the case. To ensure like-for-like comparison, historic emissions data will have to be recalculated. Companies will first need to choose a base year for which reliable and verifiable emissions data are available. Most companies select a single year as the base year. However, it is possible to choose an average of annual emissions over several consecutive years. The base year can be used as a basis for setting and tracking progress towards a set target. The base year emissions will need to be recalculated as a result of any organizational structural changes, changes in calculation methodology, or the discovery of significant errors. The diagram below is taken from the GHG Protocol corporate standard, which provides an example for the need of a recalculation. Say Company X divests Unit C in Year 3, emission from Unit C should be removed from both the base year as well as for Year 2. Any recalculation approach should be properly defined, for example, such as what will trigger a recalculation and documented for records. There are 5 principles for carbon footprinting defined by the GHG Protocol based on generally accepted financial accounting and reporting principles. Companies should apply these standards when performing a carbon footprinting exercise. The first is relevance. Ensure that GHG inventory appropriately reflects the GHG emissions of the company and serves the decision-making needs of the users, both internal and external to the company. Completeness: account for and report on all GHG emission sources and activities within the chosen inventory boundary. Disclose and justify any specific exclusions. Consistency: use consistent methodologies for comparison over time and document any changes to the data, inventory boundary, methods, or any other relevant factors in the time series. Transparency: address all relevant issues in a factual and coherent manner, based on a clear audit trail. Disclose any relevant assumptions as well as references, calculation methodologies, and data sources used. And lastly, accuracy: reduce uncertainties as far as practicable and achieve sufficient accuracy to enable users to make decisions with reasonable assurance as to the integrity of the reported information. Once you have performed the carbon footprint for your organization, you are now ready to report on the figures. Apart from reporting gross emissions, disclosing emissions intensity will allow a company to evaluate its performance in the context of an organization's specific matrix. In addition to the emission figures, companies should also provide some written explanation on how the data was derived, including any recalculations. A common medium to disclose emissions data is within the annual sustainability report or the sustainability website. The GRI standards, currently the most widely used framework for sustainability reporting, topic-specific disclosure for emissions, provide guidance on what is required to be reported. Ratings and indices such as the Dow Jones Sustainability Index and CDP also request for such data as part of their assessments. Shown here is an example of requirements listed by the GRI standards topic-specific disclosure for emissions. As you can see, other than the main gross emissions data, information that will need to be provided include the gases included, base year for calculation if applicable, sources of emission factors, consolidation approach, and any other standards, methodologies, assumptions, and/or calculation tools used. Let's take a look at two examples of Malaysian companies who have reported their GHG emissions within their annual sustainability report. The first is IOI, a Malaysian conglomerate. As you can see, the company reported on its Scope 1 and 2 emissions separately. You can also see what makes up each scope. Emissions intensity figures are provided for 3 years to allow for comparison. The organization has also provided materials it has referenced in the footnote. The second example we're going to look at is Genting Berhad. Similar to IOI, the company has also provided its gross emissions and intensity figures. A list of supporting description was also included to give a reader a sense of how the data was arrived. Depending on the standards used for reporting, more information may need to be provided on how the data is obtained. Upon establishing and reporting your organization's carbon footprint, you are now ready to set emissions reduction targets. The science-based targets is a good approach to ensure that targets set are in line with the latest climate science, providing a good narrative for your target as well as to increase the credibility of your organization's action on climate change. You can also have your data assured to ensure reliability and increase confidence in the data you report. Remember, you can only manage what you measure. Thank you for listening to this webcast on carbon footprinting for companies.